Okay, let's return to Mark Blyth. But first I want to go back to 18th century America and the campaigns in the Carolinas, and specifically to this lecture linked below by Professor Walter Edgar, and even more specifically to his throwaway line about a group of émigré Scots who had been or were the descendants of Jacobites, but threw their lot in with the Loyalist cause. Mr. Edgar expresses somewhat his incredulity that such people would throw their lot in with the king. Surely they have seen the Patriot and Braveheart, right? At which point it is perhaps useful to listen to the first episode of the American History podcast about the activities of the Sons of Liberty, linked below. And this video on the history of the tobacco trade is also useful, linked below. And while I'm throwing out links, Thomas Sowell's book Black Rednecks and White Liberals is tangentially useful, linked below, as an indication of the type of people we are dealing with. I mention this because the American Revolution, or if you prefer the American War of Independence, in the conventional telling of the tale is portrayed as very much a matter of the interface of economics and politics, political economy, if you will, famously expressed in no taxation without representation, and tea taxes and boycotts, and the rather less discussed credit system employed by the tobacco merchants. And of course there are the obvious good guys, the Patriots, and the obvious bad guys, the British. This view perpetuates today, most obviously in the excesses of the Alex Joneses of the world, who, when they are not hearing God's divine whispering, they are communing with the secular saints in the form of the Founding Fathers and espousing the spirit of 1776. Well, that is when they're not complaining about the modern Sons of Liberty attacking them for wearing Hillary for Prison t-shirts and warning of radical forces seeking to undermine the king. Okay, not the king, but the president. But in terms of the metaphor and the historical irony, you get my point. Which brings me back to those Jacobites turned Tories and the mocking professor, because I don't find it odd at all that they would choose to side with the Loyalists. For one thing, the Jacobites were not Jacobins, and were seeking to set the rightful king, in their mind, on the throne, if one wishes to take a high-minded approach to the issue, that is. Although I suspect a more accurate reason for why they got caught up in the Jacobite rebellion was that they owed allegiance to someone or another, and were given the option to be killed by that person that they owed allegiance to, or to join them and kill the enemy. Oh, and if they chose the romantic cause of the Stuarts, then they might get rich nicking other people's stuff. And the same thing applies to the latter war, the American Revolution. Looking at the Snow Campaign and the Battle of Great Cane Brake, linked below, yes, you can see it as heroic patriots striking a blow for victory, or you can see it as a bunch of thugs running a protection racket, with the added twist that if independence is finally won, those same patriots can go and nick the Indians' land, and the latter-day Sons of Liberty can cry racism and go and protest about pipelines, linked below. My point being that if you were one of those ex-Jacobites and you had lived within your means and kept out of the clutches of the tobacco merchants with their payday loans on your crop, and spent your time minding your own business, Would it really be so surprising that you chose to fight against a load of hotheads who no doubt had crawled out of their mother's basement, having got themselves in hock to the tobacco merchants? Especially if, in the name of liberty and free speech, they start tarring and feathering you and your neighbours for disagreeing with them. At which point I would suggest reading Liberty's Exiles by Maya Yasanov, link below. And before you get all brainless yank on me, I use this as an example because I've been reading a lot about the War of Independence lately. I could have used practically endless examples from history, though the contrast I'm seeking to draw is particularly stark in relation to this conflict, namely that partisan support is as much a matter of local conditions as headline political slogans. Oh, and I received a comment on my last video on this subject, which, due to the vagaries of the YouTube spam filter, got deleted. But in essence, it was asking me, or telling me, about a question I had posed about why the conditions in Scotland were different to England or Wales or Ireland with regard to the economics and politics of austerity. The short answer is Ravenscraig, link below, which in a sense does tie it in with theories of globalization, both in why it was built and in why it was closed, though it equally ties in with various other sticking plasters of the Union akin to Walter Scott's creation of tartan, link below. And yes, I know it is Wikipedia, but I couldn't be asked to scroll through endless pages of tartan manufacturers and gift shops claiming that Walter Scott's role in the 1822 royal visit is an interesting wee story. But there's always been a Clan Haile Selassie tartan. Oh, and I have listened to 5 or 6 lectures and interviews with Mr. Blyth recently, and jolly interesting they are, particularly if you want to be a political consultant. However, I keep coming back to one of the opening statements made by Mr. Blyth in the video I linked to in my previous video, link below. He gives a quote from John Maynard Keynes made during World War II. Mr. Blyth then projects this quote forward onto the 1970s and seeks to make it about the industrial strikes and unrest of that decade, without acknowledging that in Britain there were more strikes and more industrial unrest during World War II than at any other time in our history. The irony is that the case Mr. Blyth is making with regard to labour and capital and the interface between them playing out in politics applies in precisely the way he describes in World War II, but far less so in the 1970s. One doesn't only see it in industry, it applied in the armed forces too, with senior military staff writing memos warning of Bolshevism due to the activities of soldiers' councils and committees, which in some accounts were even called Soviets. And again, this confirms Mr. Blyth's thesis that labour, in the form of fighting men, held sway over what might be called the capitalist class in the form of their officers due to economic conditions of supply and demand. An historical parallel would be the Spithead Mutiny of 1797, linked below, which arguably led to the creation of the Royal Navy and much of the mythology of the 19th century, both in the Navy and in the nation as a whole. And one sees a very similar mythology spring up in post-war Britain, and likewise about the 1970s, and indeed almost every historical period and event has a similar mythology, for the simple reason that mythology is a useful tool for lancing the boil of radical discontent, or for sweetening or poisoning events depending on one's taste or desired political outcome. However, and I go back to this issue of looking at politics in terms of specific people, and I would recommend the various lectures at the National Archives, linked below, which offer insight into quite often obscure and very narrow studies, such as, for instance, the Lunacy Act of 1845 and the history of gaslighting, the psychological state, not the street lighting, which, when combined with other things, offer a broad perspective on matters, often helping one to see what the myth is compared with the potential actual lived experience. And no, I don't criticise Mr. Blyth for painting in broad strokes, often without historical perspective. That is his job. He is, after all, educating political economists. He is not teaching history. And no doubt those students will become lobbyists and spin doctors of various sorts, so they don't need to worry about specifics. And I wouldn't expect Mr. Blyth, when lecturing in American universities, to point out the industrial and political strife in wartime Britain. It would confuse them, fed as they are on the myth of the golden generation, etc. Myths are very important. Oh, yeah. Right, back to poring over the order of battle for the American left wing at the Battle of Brandywine.